vores protest mod krigen. Anders Fogh, Bush, Per Stig Møller og blod på hænderne for civile i alle mulige interesser.
Members of Congress, I have the high privilege of presenting to you the President of the United States.
I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
The United States went to war in Iraq because of a long-held neoconservative ambition to use regime change in Iraq, one of the biggest and wealthiest and most centrally located states in the Middle East, as a catalyst. The idea was that this would be the first domino that would fall. And because of its importance, it would lead to free enterprise and liberal democracy breaking out through the rest of the region. We must prevent the terrorists and regimes who seek chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons from threatening the United States and the world. The decision to go ahead and launch this war, which many neoconservatives had been anxious to do for some time, evidently was made not long after the 9/11 terrorist attack. Not because 9/11 had anything to do with Iraq, but because it so drastically and so suddenly changed the mood of the American people. It made them far more willing to take risks and bear costs in the name of national security. And one of the main ways in which the promoters of the war sold the idea publicly was to continually associate 9/11 and Iraq, not necessarily as a matter of any tight argument, but simply as a matter of rhetoric, constantly repeating those two things in the same sentence. Iraq, 9/11, Iraq, 9/11, again and again and again. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
Plans for war in Iraq are already high on the agenda when George W. Bush is elected as President of the USA in January 2001. Bush's inner circle consists of neoconservatives like Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Since the 1990s, the neocons have had a vision of a new, more offensive foreign policy for the US, to export democracy and American values to the Middle East. Iraq is at the top of the list, and so the US is actively supporting regime change to remove dictator Saddam Hussein. 9/11 is a turning point for the campaign to sell the war on. The Bush administration now piles the pressure on US intelligence agencies to collect evidence that links Iraq with weapons of mass destruction.
I was asked in February 2002 if I would come into the CIA headquarters to meet with all the people in our intelligence services who knew anything about uranium, knew anything about Iraq. The Office of the Vice President had asked a question on a piece of intelligence that they'd received. And the intelligence was of the existence of a memorandum of sale of 500 tons of uranium yellowcake from Niger to Iraq. It was an important question to ask simply because if Saddam had in fact been looking for uranium yellowcake in Niger, there would be only one reason, and it would be to create a nuclear weapons program. So I spent 8 days out there, and I talked to everybody that I could find who knew anything about it. This was a question of understanding whether or not one could actually execute on a bill of sale for 500 metric tons in a way that nobody would know about. Now, 500 metric tons represent as much as 40% increase of the annual production. You don't ramp up production 40% or 25% from 1 month to the next without all 5 consortium partners knowing about it. And the consortium partners included the French, the Austrians, the Japanese, and in essence, it just could not take place without everybody knowing. The report conveyed, I think, that there was no there, which should have been enough.
Joe Wilson reports to the CIA that it is highly unlikely that Iraq has acquired uranium ore in Niger. The CIA compiles a dossier and submits it to the Vice President's office.
One of the central facts about intelligence work on Iraq that isn't really well understood publicly is how much influence on intelligence officers is exerted by the political environment who are already determined to launch this war and already decided what they wanted to do and already had decided what lines of argument they would use publicly to try to sell the war.
We were running up to this meeting between President and Prime Minister at the President's Ranch in Crawford, Texas. My role was to prepare the ground for this meeting. And we knew the Americans were pursuing regime change. We didn't know how they wanted to do it or when they wanted to do it, and they didn't know themselves. And we get there, and immediately Blair is whisked off to the ranch with President Bush, and nobody goes with them. Rice doesn't go, the Downing Street team don't go, I don't go. They are alone all Friday night until Saturday morning. Now, if you, in some ways, if you're an official, the most terrifying thing that can happen is that you lose your leader. And he's left alone with the US president. You think, without us being there to advise him, what the hell is he going to agree to? So Friday night, the two teams, me and the Downing Street team and the American team, we all go out to a Tex-Mex restaurant in Waco. So I remember saying to Manning and Powell, what are they deciding? What have they done? And they said, we don't know. We've got to debrief the Prime Minister. We haven't had time yet. So nobody knew. Nobody knew. But then Blair gave a great speech at Texas A&M University on a Sunday morning. It was a very good speech. But one of the things he said that he'd never said before was he supported regime change.
If necessary, the action should be military. And again, if necessary and justified, it should involve regime change.
So suddenly, out of nowhere, comes regime change, which is not, until that moment, official British foreign policy. And it gives clues to what they must have talked about in private. In international law, as interpreted by the British, we don't do regime change. Foreign Office lawyers are saying to us, that's illegal. Saddam may be a bad man, but that's not good enough. You need a Security Council resolution to make that legitimate.
Tony Blair returns to London. He now knows that the US is determined to remove Saddam Hussein by military force.
The American relationship and our ability to partner America in these difficult issues is of fundamental importance, not just to this country, but to the wider world.
Like Bush, Blair argues that it is morally right to remove the dictator. The people of Iraq deserve their freedom. But the UK Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, is adamant that the United Kingdom cannot launch an invasion of Iraq without a mandate from the UN Security Council.
I had this source. He rang me up and said, I need to meet. I said, where? And he said, where we met before, you know, which was sort of like, so he's obviously thinking, I'm not going to say on the phone where we're going to meet. So I'm sort of security aware now about this. You know, he's sort of, by his own approach, he's made me sort of think I've got to be careful. Then I went to this club. In London, there are these gentlemen's clubs, you know, very posh and old-fashioned. He put these documents on the table.
The secret documents describe a meeting between Tony Blair and his cabinet at Downing Street, 9 months before the war starts. They discuss ways of legitimizing the inevitable war with Iraq.
The whole war campaign included selling the whole idea of going into battle to the public. And that's what was going on here with all these memos, and that was what they were talking about all the time. And you know, the need to wrong foot Saddam Hussein. I mean, that phrase was actually used. We need to wrong foot Saddam Hussein using the weapons inspectors. If we can get him to refuse the weapons inspectors, see something they need to see, then we've got the excuse to go to war.
The plan is to impose extensive arms inspections on the Saddam regime. Failure to cooperate will automatically lead to a UN mandate to go to war. Now Tony Blair has to sell further weapons inspections to Bush.
There is a very important private meeting at which Colin Powell meets the president. And I think Condoleezza Rice was there as well. And basically what Powell says is, look, if you want to do this thing, go to Iraq. Don't forget, if you smash it, you own it. We'd be crazy to go into Iraq without trying to get international support, which means going to the UN. And Bush buys the argument. Bush is not the crazed neocon he's sometimes accused of. The neocons were quite separate from Bush. Bush was not a Christian evangelical, and he was not a neocon. He was something else. And he actually announces that he's going to go to the UN and starts reaching out to European leaders.
In July 2002, Denmark took over the EU chairmanship, and America can use Denmark's support. As EU chairman, Anders Fogh Rasmussen is able to work to obtain EU backing for the forthcoming invasion.
Vi har haft et fantastisk godt møde, meget afslappet, muntert under tiden også. Jeg har på min side understreget, at Danmark fra første færd har stået bag USA i kampen mod den internationale terrorisme.
Præsidenten og jeg har opbygget et personligt venskab, som gør, at vi kan snakke meget direkte om international politik. Præsident Bush værdsætter loyalitet, og han betragter Danmark som en loyal og troværdig partner, og derfor så smitter det også af politisk, og giver derfor Danmark langt større indflydelse i Washington, end vores størrelse i sig selv berettiger til.
Denmark assumes a key role in obtaining EU backing for a new UN resolution, delivering a final ultimatum to Saddam Hussein.
Da vi har overtaget EU-formandskabet 1. juli, så skal jeg jo som formand for EU-udenrigsministrene hurtigst muligt afsted til Washington. Vi har det danske skoleskib liggende i havnen i Washington, og der modtager jeg Colin Powell. Og så går vi ned i kaptajnens kahyt, og det vil sige, at vi var meget få sammen, da det er en lille kahyt. Og det betyder så også, at fortroligheden bliver stærkere, fordi det bliver den jo, når man sidder 4 mennesker sammen. Så siger han, at vi skal ikke tage fejl af, at Bush ser meget alvorligt på Irak. Men han siger ikke, hvad Bush vil gøre ved Irak. Jeg havde jo kendskab til den her diskussion i USA omkring FN-sporet. Det var jo ikke nogen hemmelighed for os, der i hvert fald talte med amerikanerne. Så derfor var jeg også glad for at høre, at han sagde, at han ville arbejde gennem Sikkerhedsrådet. Og jeg synes også, det var relevant, han sagde, men det kan jo ikke bruges til noget FN, hvis det ender som et folkeforbund, altså tandløst.
Blair is very, very anxious that Bush will ignore the UN. So the Blair mission is to find out what it is that Bush intends and to influence Bush to do what we want him to do.
It's my honor to welcome the Prime Minister back to Camp David. I look forward to spending a good 3 hours talking to our friend about how to keep the peace. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about how to promote freedom around the world.
The deal is Blair gets going through the UN, although we don't know what it means. And Bush gets another statement of support.
Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've had several hours of talks with the President. And the talks were excellent, as you would expect. And I think the key thing really to say to you is that we have a shared analysis, a shared determination to deal with the issue of weapons of mass destruction.
Then they all go home, and we have about a week before the UN meeting where the President will speak. And there is a huge battle inside Washington. The State Department was saying to Bush, we need you to say that we must work for a resolution, a final warning to Saddam. Meantime, the Cheney people say, Saddam has jerked the UN around for a decade. The last thing we need is going to the UN. So Cheney was really pushing back. And then on the eve of Bush's speech to the United Nations, I rang up some people and they said, we're on draft number 22 or whatever it was. I mean, we have no idea which way this speech is going to go.
The conduct of the Iraqi regime is a threat to the authority of the United Nations and a threat to peace. All the world now faces a test. Are Security Council resolutions to be honored and enforced or cast aside without consequence? Will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant?
And then on his teleprompter, apparently, the paragraph which referred to support for a resolution, working for a resolution, wasn't on the teleprompter text. Now, conspiracy or mistake. But Bush could remember that there was something missing.
My nation will work with the UN Security Council to meet our common challenge.
And to the astonishment of all of us, he talks about working for resolutions in the plural, which was probably a mistake.
We will work with the UN Security Council for the necessary resolutions. But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted.
But the key thing was, it was American policy now to work for a resolution which would give Saddam Hussein one last chance. And we were cheering in London because we saw this as the means to create an international coalition. Satisfy the legalities, heaven, diplomatic heaven.
What intelligence officers like myself were witnessing as far as the campaign for selling the war was mostly the same thing that the American people as a whole were hearing. The public speeches, the statements. Mr. Cheney, the vice president, kicked off the main part of the campaign with a major speech in which he made some very definite statements about the unconventional weapons programs of the Iraqis.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
That wasn't coming from the intelligence community, and the analysts in the intelligence agency who were working the problem of Iraqi weapons program were hearing that stuff for the first time, the same as the people in the audience were hearing it when the vice president delivered his speech.
He now is trying, through his illicit procurement network, to acquire the equipment he needs to be able to enrich uranium.
Aluminum tubes.
Specifically aluminum tubes. There's a story in the New York Times this morning.
There was a famous story that was written on the front page of the New York Times, just as the White House was rolling out its marketing campaign to sell the war, that said that U.S. intelligence officials had acquired important new evidence showing that Iraq was aggressively restarting its nuclear program because they had identified aluminum tubes that the Iraqis were purchasing that could only be used as centrifuges for a nuclear weapons program. Once you get the front page story in the New York Times, once you get that imagery of the mushroom cloud, and then, by the way, I should add that the day that that story appeared, Vice President Cheney was on Meet the Press, one of the top interview shows in American television, and is asked about this claim about aluminum tubes, and it says, of course, I can't discuss classified intelligence, but you might want to take a look at the front page of the New York Times today. They're reporting something. And of course, that was a story which the administration had leaked to the New York Times so that they could promote these claims. It was a very skillful manipulation of the American press, and unfortunately, the country's leading newspaper went along.
In September, Blair goes on the offensive with a report from military intelligence. The MI5 report presents new evidence that Saddam Hussein has an active program for weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq has tried to purchase uranium from Africa.
The day began with the 50-page dossier being released in Whitehall.
It says he's still making chemical and biological weapons, which his troops can deploy at just 45 minutes' notice, and that he's sought to acquire significant quantities of uranium for nuclear weapons. Iraqi officials are said to have been on shopping trips to Africa. No countries are named, but Niger, Gabon, Namibia, and South Africa all produce the radioactive metal.
Forsvarets efterretningstjeneste fik 2 britiske rapporter, en uklassificeret og en hemmelig klassificeret. Og så skulle vi skrive en ny trusselsvurdering. Der har ikke været skrevet trusselsvurderinger på Irak i pæn tid forinden. Den ene af de britiske rapporter indeholdt et varsel på 45 minutter for indsættelse af biologiske og kemiske våben. Almindelig sund fornuft sagde her, at det kunne ikke passe. Og en ting, der yderligere var meget kritisabel ved den måde, det stod på, det var selvfølgelig, at der var ingen nærmere beskrivelse af, hvad de 45 minutter gik på. Om det var fra Saddam gav ordren, eller om det var den tid, det tog at få flyene i luften, eller hvad det var. Der var intet, der beskrev det nærmere.
One of the unfortunate things for a small state who became part of the coalition of the willing is that because they don't have their own independent sources of information as much as a major power like the United States does, they are, in a sense, dealing at the same level as the public is. But here in the United States, for the U.S. Congress as well as for the public, the issue got dumbed down to one of he's got them or he doesn't have them. And I'm afraid smaller countries like Denmark were just kind of taken along for the ride.
Det er for sent, når først giftgassen er spredt over en af vores store byer.
The intelligence picture they paint concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, and that he's actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
According to the British government, Iraqi regime could launch a biological or chemical attack in as little as 45 minutes after the order were given.
All these various papers and estimates that were done back in 2002 were part of a campaign both to influence the thinking of the American public and, very closely related to that, the thinking of members of Congress who did vote to authorize the use of military force in Iraq in the fall of 2002, a vote that passed.
We had a matrix, and that matrix had all the things we'd need across the top: political support, troops, overflight rights. For example, Denmark, it was probably political support, maybe a few troops. You go out and find as many allies and friends as you can to help you. in whatever way they will offer to help you and you need, and you sign them up. And then you meet with them later and you say thank you.
Europa og USA må trække på samme hammel i bestræbelserne på at forhindre, at tyranniske og uansvarlige regimer kommer til at råde over masseødelæggelsesvåben. Saddam Hussein har i årevis siddet FN's bindende påbud overhørig om at skille sig af med sådanne forfærdelige våben. Det internationale samfunds bestræbelser på at håndhæve disse påbud gennem Sikkerhedsrådet har Danmarks og EU's fulde støtte. FN bør nu leve op til sit ansvar.
At the UN building in New York, the Security Council started talks on the new resolution calling for the disarmament of Iraq. In the initial draft, Colin Powell demands that if Saddam refuses to cooperate with the UN's arms inspectors, it will automatically unleash a mandate for war. China, Russia and France think this is too harsh. Dominique de Villepin, the French foreign minister, supports a resolution that does not automatically lead to a mandate for war. The Danish chairmanship has a tough task maintaining a united front among EU member states. In particular, the UK and France don't agree.
As presidency of the European Union, Denmark will strive to build a common position of the Union. If Iraq's defiance continues, the Security Council must face its responsibilities.
After 7 weeks of talks, the Security Council unanimously adopts Resolution 1441 on the disarmament of Iraq. The resolution demands that Saddam admits UN's arms inspectors. If he fails to cooperate with them, the UN must adopt a new resolution before it can unleash a mandate for war.
And the most important thing that it does is it demands of Saddam that he prove his innocence. You're already guilty, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do that, and prove to us that you can be a good international citizen. I'm paraphrasing that.
On 18 November 2002, the UN's arms inspectors returned to Iraq. They're led by Swedish diplomat and lawyer Hans Blix. The resolution requires Iraq's unconditional cooperation with the UN.
He was going to check on Iraqi holdings of weapons of mass destruction. He had just started. And you knew that he couldn't come up with any definitive conclusions for 6 months minimum. Meantime, the American war machine was ready to go in January. How in God's name were you going to try to synchronize what Blix was doing over here with what the Anglo-American, Australian, and whoever else was their war machine? It was already assembling down in the Gulf.
Maybe they hoped that the Iraqis would reject the resolution 4041, or else that the Iraqis would do as they did in the 90s, to block, deny access to inspectors. And again, they could go to the council and hopefully get an authorization. But the fact was that the Iraqis accepted the resolution with some way or other. They didn't reject it, and that they did not deny access.
If there is a breach of the existing UN resolution, I have no doubt at all that the right thing to do in those circumstances is to disarm Saddam by force.
We, the Brits and the Americans, had to try and find this thing called the smoking gun, which would then short-circuit the diplomatic Blix process and enable us to say to the world, yep, we've caught Saddam red-handed.
Let there be no misunderstanding. If Saddam Hussein does not fully disarm, for the safety of our people and for the peace of the world, we will lead a coalition to disarm him. And if war is forced upon us, we will fight with the full force and might of the United States military, and we will prevail. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. From Africa, he said. The African country to which the president had been referring in the State of the Union address was Niger. That really ran counter to what I and others had concluded. They had essentially lied to us.
The president quoted a British paper. We did not know at the time. No one knew at the time in our circles. Maybe someone knew down in the bowels of the agency, but no one in our circles knew that there were doubts and suspicions that this might be a forgery.
That's when it became apparent to me that the U.S. government was not going to come clean. They were not going to tell the truth on this matter unless I forced their hand myself. And I knew that the New York Times was interested in my telling the story. If I were to tell the story in my own voice, my own words, and put my name to it, it would have much more impact. It was entitled What I Did Not Find in Africa, and it said basically that the administration had skewed the intelligence and that we deserved to know whether we had gone to war under false pretenses.
Colin Powell was sent up to New York in early February to make the case for Saddam still having weapons of mass destruction. It was quite persuasive at the time, but has since turned out to be largely illusory.
Powell comes into my office and he throws a sheaf of papers down on my desk. It's a 48-page description of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction programs. And he says, this is my script for my presentation at the United Nations on the 5th of February. We had something like 6 days and nights to get this monumental presentation ready and to convince, not the UN Security Council, that was one audience, but it wasn't the most important one. The American people, of course, were the first and most important audience, and the international community was the second. I think all told in those 6-7 days, I probably slept 6 hours, as did most of the members of my team.
Well, it was a day of enormous drama at the UN. The very fact that Colin Powell and the Bush administration decided to come to the UN and present their evidence had been hugely anticipated. They had tried in other ways to convince both their allies and the Secretary General privately of the nature of their evidence, how compelling it was, and how much it demonstrated Saddam's non-compliance, but it had failed. It was a period where the United States seemed to listen less and less to the rest of the world. And so Kofi Annan played very much a role where member states and leaders would come to him and say to him what they really feared saying directly to the administration in Washington. The war and the run-up to the war became less and less about Iraq and more, for a lot of countries, about the United States and its role in the world.
We relocated totally to Langley, and we stayed there for 5-6 days and nights. I had to translate Arabic, Farsi. I had to get it on tape. I had to pick the satellite photography that was going into the presentation. I had to get clearances for that. We were trying to convict Iraq as if we were in a court of law. And we had all this circumstantial evidence, none of it a smoking gun, but all of it in its entirety, a mass of circumstantial evidence that would be so overwhelming, presented by the only member of the administration who had real bona fides with the international community, with the UN Security Council, and with the American people, and so it would be convincing.
Last November 8th, this council passed Resolution 1441 by unanimous vote. The purpose of that resolution was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
George Tenet had discovered that at one point in our preparations, Secretary Powell had come up to me. He was angry. And he had put me in a room alone with him, closed the door, and said how uncomfortable he was with talking about Al-Qaeda, Baghdad, contacts and in talking about an active nuclear program. So I said, fine, let's throw it out. And we agreed to throw both of those things out. Well, those were huge items to throw out of the presentation. Active nuclear program and contacts with Al-Qaeda. George Tenet, within 30 minutes, takes care of both of them. He comes in breathless and tells us about an interrogation that has just taken place of a high-level Al-Qaeda operative that not only reveals substantial contacts, but reveals that the Mukhabarat in Iraq was actually training Al-Qaeda in how to use chemical and biological weapons. Whoa, that was devastating. That's all George said. We put it back in.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
Later, we discover that was Sheikh al-Libi. He was interrogated in Egypt with no U.S. personnel present. He was waterboarded, and he even said afterwards that he said what he said to get the waterboarding to stop. The most powerful things to me were the NSA intercepts. I mean, I'd been to the NSA. I knew their capabilities. So I'm listening to all these intercepts, and they're in Arabic or Farsi. I'm listening to it, and I'm actually trying to figure out how I'm going to technically use these things.
Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between two commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps. Listen.
Hello. 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 إبراهيم شلونك؟ الله يسلمك سيدي. شلون صرت؟ الله يحفظك. شلونك بعد؟ خير الحمد لله سيدي. لك إبراهيم. نعم سيدي. الحين اكتب يمك. أي طيب.
So I'm listening to it and I'm saying, this could all be just the opposite of what it's supposed to be. This guy could be saying, get rid of that piece of equipment because it violates sanctions.
إبراهيم. نعم سيدي. لك إبراهيم. وياك سيدي. رفع. عبارة. أوامر الأعصاب.
This guy could be saying, take nerve agent out of your communications instructions because we don't have any nerve agents anymore. So I'm listening to it and I'm saying, all of that's circumstantial and all of it is interpretable from the other side, as well as from this, the negative side that he's got these things. And it was troubling even at that moment when I realized that. What I thought was the most powerful part of the presentation had a double meaning, maybe.
The Security Council has a horseshoe table, and he sat at one end of it, and I sat at the other side, so I could see him straight across the room. And I guess I kept a fairly poker face, not showing any reactions, because there were 1,000 cameras in the room, and one had to be fairly straight-faced. But I felt very skeptical about many things he said.
I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441. How much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's non-compliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough?
The UN Security Council was the first time I saw the whole thing without any interruptions and distractions. I have to be honest with you and tell you that my first reaction was a great sigh of relief. The very fact that we had done it to the point where there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you could perceive those things, gave me such a sigh of relief, because technically, mechanically, I thought I had an impossible task. I had to get out of there. I just had to get out of there. I cannot escape the conclusion that there had to be some lying going on. I think that the groupthink was such that it didn't matter, because when we get to Iraq, he had them before, he'll have them then. And when we get to Iraq, we're going to find something. And so it doesn't matter what the details are now. Let's just get it out there. Let's convince people. Let's go there, because they're going to find something. And the shock in everyone's face when they didn't find anything. And I must say, guilt here too, because I helped put it together unwittingly.
Looking at Saddam in Iraq from Washington, you know, this is Americans' assumption. It's always about us. Well, yes, Saddam did think about Washington. That was important. But he worried a lot more about Tehran much of the time. And many of his ambiguous statements about WMD, many of his incentives for doing things, were more keyed on Iran than towards the West. This was an insight that, you know, was not prominent in Washington.
It became obvious in what danger Iraq was and where the U.S. seemed to be heading, that they were serious. It was not a paper tiger that was lying around. The U.S. began to build up the troops already in the summer of 2002. And I think it's very likely Iraqis would not have accepted inspection had it not been for the U.S. buildup. And then as they saw this gradually building up more and more, and I think they got really scared, proactive, almost frantic, I would say, in February 2003.
On 7 March 2003, Hans Blix presents the results of 3 months of inspections. The inspectors have investigated over 600 sites in Iraq.
The numerous initiatives which are now taken by the Iraqi side can be seen as active or even proactive. I reported to the Council precisely the increased kind of cooperation that we had received, and the tone was a different one in February, and end of February and beginning of March. When the tone changed, it was because the reality changed.
There is no indication that Iraq has attempted to import aluminum tubes for use in centrifuge enrichment. After 3 months of intrusive inspections, we have to date found no evidence or plausible indication of the revival of a nuclear weapon program in Iraq.
Even with a proactive Iraqi attitude induced by continued outside pressure, it will still take some time to verify sites and items. It will not take years, nor weeks, but months.
There's just the inexorable flow to war. The most inexorable part is the deployment of military forces, because when you deploy them, you better use them. Are you going to bring them home once you've got them in Kuwait and at ship and flowing them from the north and flowing them from the south? And no. So you set that inexorable mechanism in motion. Doesn't matter whether you made a decision or not, and you go to war.
I think already from 2002, they had an invasion default mode. They don't really care about inspections. We knew what the attitude of the vice president of the US was. But I think that if we had gone on with our inspections a couple of months, and we had gone to all the sites given to us by intelligence and found no weapons, because there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, I think it would have been much more difficult for the US to go on with the plans for invasion. So a few months more, yes, that could have well have made a difference.
I look back on it and I wish ardently that I had gone ahead with my deepest feelings and just left. It wouldn't have changed anything, but it sure would have made my life easier. I don't think it would have changed anything if Powell had left. They would have just found somebody else. Condi was ready to take over.
Bush did help Blair try and get the second resolution. he did make the last effort. And this led to Blair in a futile search with the Americans for at least a majority of the Security Council to back a second resolution favoring war.
As Security Council talks continue, a British newspaper breaks a story. The Observer reports that a British intelligence analyst has leaked a mail revealing that the UK and the US are bugging Security Council diplomats.
It was an email from NSA, National Security Agency, which is the US counterpart to GCHQ. And as I read it, I was more and more amazed at what I was reading. It was a very specific request to the British intelligence services to eavesdrop, intercept communications of the 6 swing nations that were sitting on the Security Council at the time, and gather any information that we could on these diplomats that would allow the US to either blackmail or bribe them or somehow play some kind of a dirty tricks on them so that they would vote yes, which would authorize the invasion of Iraq. I just felt increasingly angry, and I felt that that was an explosive email that had the potential to derail the whole bandwagon that was charging ahead. And I felt it needed to get out into the public domain as quickly as possible because time was of the essence.
The revelation damages British and American credibility in the Security Council.
The members of the Security Council now face a grim choice. If they fail to agree on a common position and action is taken without the authority of the Security Council, the legitimacy and support for any such action will be seriously impaired.
Blair increases the pressure on the Security Council. He tables a draft for a new resolution, stating that Saddam has missed his chance, and this means war. But an overwhelming Security Council majority still thinks the dispute can be resolved by diplomacy, and that the inspectors should be given more time.
When you have active cooperation on the part of Iraq, as the inspector said, you don't talk about days. Mr. Blick said, not a year, not years, not weeks, but months.
When plans to legitimize the invasion through the UN meet opposition, Bush decides to go it alone. He insists that Saddam has already breached previous UN resolutions. Tony Blair and Anders Fogh Rasmussen support him, but they don't yet have the backing of their own parliaments to follow Bush to war.
Nu må Danmark være klar over, at der ikke er en ny beslutning fra FN. Vi har aldrig forlangt den. Så må vi med Folketingets partier drøfte i morgen, hvad er så konsekvensen i forhold til Danmark.
Jeg skal så her for en god ordens skyld gøre opmærksom på, hvad det drejer sig om. VX nervegas og senepsgas inden for det kemiske område.
Når man sammenholder, hvad han siger, da han læser op af papirerne, med hvad der rent faktisk står i papirerne, så kan man se, at han læser ikke hele den del af det her afsnit om Iraks masseødelæggelsesvåben. Den del, der handler om atomvåben, springer han bare over og så læser videre.
Det er altså ikke noget, man kan tale sig fra. Det er noget, man er nødt til at reagere på. Dette er problemet.
Det papir er et håndakt, som er skrevet af embedsmænd i Udenrigsministeriet. Og det baserer sig blandt andet på FN's inspektioner og på det internationale atomenergiagentur IAEA. Og det, der står i det afsnit, det er, at Irak har ikke noget atomprogram. Der er ikke noget atomvåbenprogram, og der er ikke noget atomprogram. Og det er ikke blevet genoptaget, siden det blev nedlagt i forbindelse med den første Golfkrig. Det vil sige, at der er ikke nogen form for beviser for, at Irak skulle have et atomvåbenprogram. Det er fuldstændig faret af banen. Det papir, det står Per Stig Møller med på Folketingets talerstol og holder den oplysning tilbage.
Det egentlige er jo de ting, jeg nævnte. Det er jo det egentlige.
Så går der et kvarter, og så står statsminister Anders Fogh Rasmussen over i statsministeriet og holder pressemøde om den her beslutning om at gå i krig. Og der siger han, dertil kommer risikoen for, at Irak snart har atomvåben.
Og dertil kommer den farlige trussel fra langtrækkende missiler og risikoen for, at han snart vil råde over atomvåben.
Altså, det er jo notorisk ikke sandt.
Hvis man altid vil være 100% sikker på, at beviserne er i orden, så kan man jo altså risikere, at terroristerne de slår først. Og der synes jeg, at vi har en legitim ret til at forebygge terrorisme ved at være dem, der selv slår først.
The US and the UK justify the invasion by claiming that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. In Denmark, the primary reason for war is Saddam's failure to cooperate with UN's arms inspectors.
61 stemte for, 50 imod. Forslaget er vedtaget.
Denmark's participation in the war was decided despite the assessment by the Security Council majority that Iraq was in fact cooperating with the inspectors.
Vi har valgt at følge USA og Storbritannien, fordi de har besluttet at gøre det rigtige og det nødvendige.
Huge protests. One of Blair's finest oratorical performances was in the House of Commons to persuade the majority of MPs to accept the argument, but he did exaggerate the significance of the intelligence.
In London, the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, has now changed his view of a legal justification for the use of force. The UK decides to align with the US. Invasion doesn't require a new UN mandate. Blair wins the vote in the House of Commons and gets the go-ahead to follow the US to war.
The United Nations Security Council has not lived up to its responsibilities, so we will rise to ours. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing. For their own safety, all foreign nationals, including journalists and inspectors, should leave Iraq immediately.
I remember that when the US went in, Colin Powell, I think, said that this is the moment of truth. Well, it was the moment of truth, but not the truth that the US government had held. Truth is the first casualty in war. Well, truth had been a casualty all through.
Der var ikke noget mandat fra Sikkerhedsrådet. Der var ikke noget spørgsmål om retten til selvforsvar. Der var ikke noget spørgsmål om en ret til at foretage en humanitær intervention. Der var ikke noget lovligt, folkeretligt grundlag for at iværksætte den aktion.
He did not have stocks of weapons of mass destruction. He did not have chemical or biological weapons. He did not have an active nuclear program. And that's what, the average American, the average world citizen thought they would find, and it wasn't there. And so what was seen as the premise for the war vanished.
The US and the UK must face the fact that they went to war on incorrect grounds. The political reputations of George W. Bush and Tony Blair will be forever tarnished by the war they started, a war declared by the UN to be illegal.
I regret deeply and profoundly the loss of life, whether from our own armed forces, those of other nations, the civilians who help people in Iraq, or the Iraqis themselves.
Quiet, please, please.
He said the only way you can influence Americans is by being close to them. But he got so close that the leverage he might have had, he lost. The international coalition collapsed. We did not exhaust UN processes because we didn't put these things down as iron conditions. Blair never said, I can't do it if you don't do these things. He never said that. In the end, what he said was, whatever you decide to do, George, I'm with you.
Det handler overhovedet ikke om masseødelæggelsesvåben, men om alt muligt andet, navnlig at Saddam Hussein ikke ville samarbejde med FN's Sikkerhedsråd. Og det var det, som var grunden til, at den danske regering traf beslutning om at deltage i krigen.
Altså, det står ikke i noget ordentligt forhold til hinanden. Misligholdelsen i form af manglende samarbejde, så den meget kraftige reaktion. Og navnlig ikke, når det så efterfølgende viser sig, at Saddam der i foråret 2003 faktisk var begyndt, i hvert fald i et vist omfang, at samarbejde med våbeninspektørerne.
Efterfølgende er der jo kommet mange oplysninger på bordet. Det understreger da kun, at det var meget klogt, at den danske regering brugte en anden begrundelse.
In Denmark, criticism of the war in Iraq had far from the same consequences as it had in the US and in the UK. In 2009, Anders Fogh Rasmussen gave up his post as Prime Minister of Denmark to become Secretary General of NATO.
We had it wrong. The intelligence community had it wrong, politicians had it wrong, and Saddam Hussein had it wrong. You know, his judgments about Washington were wrong. Everyone involved in this had a misconception and a misperception. Cases like this, and I would look at Iran this way, or North Korea. We really don't understand what's going on in those capitals. We don't really understand how they are making decisions. And they really don't have a clue what Washington's doing. And yet, are we really compelled to make critical decisions based on that level of ignorance?